The air in the transit conduit was a dead thing, recycled into sterility, tasting of ozone and chilled metal. It was the only air Elian had ever known, a constant, sterile hum that vibrated in the bones and promised order. Tonight, however, a new element bled into the manufactured purity. It was metallic and sharp, a scent like burnt sugar and ozone, a ghost clinging to the back of his throat. He dismissed it as an atmospheric filtration error, a minor system flaw in the Coalition's otherwise perfect machine. The data chip felt like a shard of ice against his palm, its encrypted contents a whisper of rebellion against the silent, unyielding monolith of the state. He was a null, a ghost in the system, his biology chemically neutered from birth to render him scentless, passionless, a perfect cog. His purpose was simple: to move through the city's arteries undetected, a vessel for descent, his emptiness, his greatest asset. But the ghost scent grew stronger, coiling in his lungs, and with it came a strange, unwelcome warmth that started deep in his belly and radiated outward, making his skin prickle. His breath hitched. The regulated rhythm of his heart, a cadence drilled into him by years of somatic conditioning, faltered. It stumbled, then hammered against his ribs, a frantic, chaotic drumbeat. This was not a system flaw. This was a failure within his own chassis. The inhibitors, the daily dose of chemical silence that kept the chaotic echoes of his biology muted, was failing. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. Panic was an unregulated emotion, a precursor to systemic breakdown. He was trained to purge it, to return to a state of operational calm. He recited the Coalition's primary dictum, the words a worn, smooth stone in his mind. Control is serenity. Serenity is function. But the words were hollow, drowned out by the rising tide of sensation. The sterile air was no longer sterile. It was thick with 1,000 phantom smells, the faint, acrid tang of stressed circuitry, the mineral dust of the permacrete walls, the faint, clean scent of the maintenance drone that had passed minutes before. And beneath it all, that other scent, the one that seemed to originate from his own skin, burnt sugar and something else, something soft and floral he had no name for. It was terrifying. It was a beacon. He quickened his pace, the soft soles of his utility boots making no sound on the polished floor. The exit portal was 73 meters ahead. He could make it. He had to. He was not just a courier. He was a message. The data he carried was proof of the Coalition's deepest lie, a lie built on the very inhibitors that were now betraying him. His vision began to shimmer at the edges. The cool, blue-white light of the conduit seemed to pulse with his frantic heartbeat. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he braced a hand against the wall, the metal shockingly cold against his suddenly feverish skin. The scent, his scent, bloomed around him like a chemical stain, thick and undeniable. He was no longer a ghost. He was a flare in the darkness, and he knew, with a certainty that felt like ice water in his veins, that he had been seen. A shadow detached itself from the far end of the conduit, resolving into a form, tall, broad, clad in the stark obsidian armor of a sector commander. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, a predator's economy of motion that was both beautiful and horrifying. Elian knew who it was before the helmet's polarized visor retracted. Commander Valerius, the alpha of alphas, the system's perfect enforcer, a man whose sensory acuity was rumored to be so profound that no secret, no whisper, no scent could escape him. He was a legend, A nightmare whispered among the rebellion's ranks. Valerius stopped, his distance precise, calculated. His face was a study in controlled neutrality, all sharp angles and pale, unblemished skin. But his eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on Elian with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He did not draw a weapon. He did not speak. He simply stood there, breathing the tainted air, and Elian felt utterly, irrevocably naked. "Subject 734, Valerius said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the space entirely, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floor plates. "Alias, Elian, null classification, courier for the dissident faction known as Meridian." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold precision of a diagnostic report. Elian's training screamed at him to run, to fight, to activate the failsafe that would incinerate the chip and himself along with it. But his body would not obey. It was frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of the Alpha's presence. The warmth in his gut had become a searing heat, a liquid fire that made his limbs tremble. Valerius took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Your biological signature is irregular. A scent profile has manifested, unregistered, potent." He tilted his head, a minute, curious gesture. "The system reports you as a null. The system is in error." Elian finally found his voice, a dry rasp. "I am a null." The words were a prayer to a god that had just abandoned him. Valerius gave a slight, humorless smile that did not reach his eyes. "No," he said softly, taking another step. "You are not." Two enforcers in standard tactical gear emerged from the shadows behind Valerius, their plasma rifles leveled. They flanked their commander, their movements synchronized, machine-like. Their presence broke the spell. Adrenaline, sharp and clean, cut through Elian's panic. He lunged for the emergency maintenance hatch to his left, his fingers scraping against the release panel. He was fast, trained for evasion, but they were faster. One of the enforcers caught his arm, the grip a hydraulic vice. The other slammed him against the wall, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. The data chip skittered across the floor. "Secure the asset," the first enforcer grunted, his grip tightening on Elian's arm, twisting it behind his back. The man's armored glove was coarse, the synthetic material abrading his skin. His proximity was an assault. The generic, sterilized scent of his uniform was suddenly overwhelming, a chemical harshness that made Elian's stomach clench. The second enforcer grabbed his other arm, forcing him to his knees. His face was pressed against the cold metal wall. He felt a hand, rough and impersonal, begin a pat-down, searching for other concealed items. The touch was methodical, detached, a standard procedure. It was nothing. It was everything. A low sound, almost too deep for human hearing, vibrated through the conduit. It was not a word. It was a growl, a tremor of pure, undiluted territorial rage that seemed to warp the very air. Elian froze, the enforcer's hands still on him. The pressure on his arms vanished. He heard a choked gasp, then a wet, sickening thud, then another. He dared to look up, turning his head just enough to see. Commander Valerius stood over the bodies of his own men. His hand, encased in a black gauntlet, was dripping with blood that sizzled faintly on the pristine floor. He hadn't used a weapon. He hadn't needed one. His eyes, when they met Elian's, were no longer the color of a winter storm. They were black, depthless pits of absolute fury. The air was thick with a new scent, one that smothered everything else. Pine and cold steel and something ancient and predatory. It was the commander's scent, It was the scent of an alpha claiming his territory. And Elian, kneeling on the floor amidst the sudden, silent carnage, was the territory that had just been claimed. The world narrowed to the commander's dark eyes, the blood on his glove, and the terrifying, possessive scent that wrapped around him like a shroud. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was a dense, ringing void, punctuated only by the faint, electronic hiss of the dead enforcer's comms and the slow, deliberate drip of blood from Valerius's gauntlet onto the polished floor. Each drop landed with a soft, wet tap that echoed the frantic, disordered rhythm of Elian's heart. Valerius did not move. He stood over the bodies of his subordinates, his posture unchanged, his breathing perfectly even. The storm in his eyes had receded, leaving behind a chilling calm, a placid surface over an unfathomable depth. He looked at the dead men as if they were nothing more than discarded equipment, obstacles that had been efficiently removed. He was not a murderer. He was a system correcting an error. Elian remained on his knees, unable to process the seamless, brutal efficiency of the violence. One moment, he was a prisoner being subdued. The next, his captors were dead, dispatched by their own commander for the simple act of touching him. It was an illogical, catastrophic breach of protocol. It made no sense. The coalition did not tolerate such deviations. An alpha's possessiveness was a primal flaw, a relic of a chaotic past, something to be conditioned and suppressed. For a commander, the system's paragon, to exhibit such a trait so nakedly, it was impossible. Valerius finally moved. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his boot crunching softly on a fragment of a shattered visor. He knelt, not before Elian, but beside him, his attention fixed on the data chip lying a few feet away. He picked it up with his clean hand, his movements precise, his fingers barely grazing the permacrete. He examined it for a moment, his expression unreadable, then slipped it into a sealed pouch on his belt. The evidence was secured. The mission objective was complete. The massacre was just collateral. He then turned his head, his gaze falling upon Elian. The intensity was back, but the rage was gone, replaced by something else, something colder, more analytical. It was the look of a scientist observing a volatile, fascinating, new element. Contamination, Valerius stated, his voice a low murmur. He was not looking at the blood. He was looking at the places where the enforcers had touched Elian's arms. Unsanctioned contact, a breach of containment protocol. The words were clinical, detached, a post-action justification that was so absurdly formal it bordered on madness. He was creating a new protocol in real time to explain the inexplicable. He was sanitizing his own primal outburst with the language of the system. Elian flinched back when Valerius reached for him. The commander's hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. The gesture was unexpectedly hesitant. He slowly, deliberately retracted his hand. "You will not be harmed," he said, the statement carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "You will be studied." He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. "Stand." It was a command, but it lacked the harsh, impersonal edge of a typical order. Elian's body, still trembling with a mixture of fear and the strange, lingering heat of his awakening biology, obeyed. He pushed himself up on unsteady legs, his eyes darting from the commander to the crumpled forms on the floor. The scent of Valerius, pine and cold steel, was a constant pressure against his senses, overwhelming the coppery tang of blood. It was not unpleasant. That realization was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing of all. "Follow," Valerius commanded, turning his back on the scene. He began to walk down the conduit, away from the designated exit portal, deeper into the city's secure core. He did not look back to see if Elian was complying. He simply knew. Elian's feet moved, one in front of the other, as if pulled by an invisible tether. The rational part of his mind, the part forged in the coalition's creches and training halls, screamed that this was a trap, that he was being led to a dissection table or a re-education chamber. But a deeper, more instinctual part of him, part he never knew existed until an hour ago, felt a strange sense of safety in the alpha's wake. It was the logic of the lamb following the wolf that had just slaughtered the other wolves. Insane, suicidal, and yet undeniable. They walked in silence through a labyrinth of service corridors and restricted access tunnels, the pristine white walls giving way to unpainted metal and exposed circuitry. The air grew colder, the hum of the city's inner workings more pronounced. Valerius moved with an innate knowledge of this hidden geography, his path direct and purposeful. Elian followed 2 paces behind, a prisoner on an invisible leash. The scent of burnt sugar and flowers still clung to him, a fragrant shroud of his own betrayal. And he could feel Valerius's awareness of it with every step. He was not just following the commander. He felt as if he were being drawn in, pulled by the sheer gravity of the man's presence. They finally arrived at a featureless metal door. Valerius placed his clean palm against a biometric scanner. The panel glowed green, and the door slid open with a soft hiss of compressed air. The space beyond was not a cell. It was a vast, minimalist living quarter, a study in shades of grey, white and black. A wall of floor-to-ceiling armoured glass offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the coalition's sprawling, illuminated grid. The city was a circuit board of light, beautiful and cold and utterly inhuman. The air inside was even more sterile than the rest of the city, filtered to a degree of purity that felt abrasive in Elian's newly sensitive lungs. "This will be your containment area," Valerius announced, stepping inside. He gestured to a recessed alcove that held a simple sleeping platform and a small sanitation unit. "Nourishment will be provided. You will be monitored. Do not attempt to leave." He turned to face Elian, his stormy eyes scanning him from head to foot. The analytical gaze lingered for a moment, and Elian felt a strange, involuntary shiver trace its way down his spine. "The biological anomaly you are exhibiting requires further analysis," Valerius continued, his tone returning to that of a technician reporting a fault. "Your scent? It is a data point that does not conform to established parameters. It must be understood. He was a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. He was not a person. He was not an Omega. He was an anomaly." The door hissed shut behind them, sealing them inside the sterile, silent chamber high above the city. The only sounds were the faint hum of the atmospheric processors and Elian's own ragged breathing. Valerius walked over to a dark console, his back to Elian, and began to input a series of commands. Elian stood frozen in the center of the room, a specimen in a jar, surrounded by glass and steel and the suffocating presence of the Alpha who had killed for him. He was a prisoner. But as he looked at the commander's rigid back, he felt the first, terrifying whisper of a thought that did not belong to him, a thought that felt ancient and instinctual and deeply, deeply dangerous. He was home. The first cycle in confinement passed in a haze of sensory distortion. Time, which had always been a precise, segmented commodity, measured by the coalition's synchronized chronometers, dissolved into a fluid, disorienting stream. Elian sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, a thin, sterile mattress over a metal slab, and tried to anchor himself to the familiar tenets of his training. He catalogued his surroundings, the seamless white walls, the matte grey floor, the precise 90-degree angles of the room's architecture. It was a space designed to eliminate variables, to promote a state of neutral calm. But for Elian, it was a torture chamber of sensation. His hearing, newly acute, picked up the subtle whine of the ventilation system, the whisper of data flowing through fiber optic cables embedded in the walls, the impossibly soft sound of Valerius breathing in the adjacent room. His skin felt raw, abraded by the synthetic fibers of his uniform. The filtered air, once a comforting norm, now felt thin and sharp, scratching at the back of his throat. And then there was the scent, Valerius's scent, pine and cold steel. It was not overpowering, but it was omnipresent, a low-frequency hum that permeated the entire space. It clung to the filtered air, a ghost of the Alpha's absolute authority. It was a constant reminder of his captivity, of the deadly power that lurked just beyond the wall. It should have terrified him. Instead, it settled something deep within his bones, a strange resonance that both soothed and agitated the frantic energy buzzing under his skin. He was a paradox, a walking contradiction of instinct and conditioning. The null Elian 734 knew he should be plotting his escape, analyzing weaknesses in the room's security, preparing for the inevitable interrogation and termination. But the other part of him, the emergent, unnamed creature that was unfurling in his blood and bones, wanted nothing more than to curl into a ball and let the Alpha's scent wash over him, a promise of violent, absolute safety. He was fracturing. The monolithic identity forged by the coalition was cracking under the pressure of his own biology. He brought a hand to his face, inhaling. The scent of burnt sugar and something like night-blooming jasmine was still there, emanating from his own skin. It was the smell of his fear, his confusion, his reawakening. It was the scent of an Omega. The word felt alien in his mind, a clinical designation from a history text, a biological flaw the coalition had supposedly engineered into obsolescence. Omegas were things of the past, cautionary tales of emotional chaos and primal weakness. He was not weak. He was a meridian operative, disciplined and resilient. He was not that. A panel in the wall slid open with a soft chime, revealing a tray. On it was a nutrient, paste pouch and a bulb of purified water. Standard coalition rations. He stared at it, his stomach twisting into a knot. The thought of consuming the bland, synthetic sustenance was repulsive. His body craved something he couldn't name. Something rich, something real. Another sign of the system failure raging within him. He ignored the tray. Hours bled into one another. He watched the city lights beyond the armored glass shift and pulse, a silent, sprawling organism of perfect order. He was a glitch in that perfection, a variable that had slipped through the cracks, and the man in the next room was the system's primary diagnostic tool, tasked with finding him, containing him, and understanding him before he could corrupt the whole. He could hear Valerius moving occasionally, the soft, near-silent tread of his boots on the floor, the quiet snap of a console being activated. The commander was working, analyzing the data from Elian's capture, dissecting the event, stripping it of its primal horror, and rendering it into cold, logical data points. The deaths of his men would be logged as a necessary expenditure to contain a high-level biological threat. Protocol would be rewritten. The system would adapt. It always did. Late into the pseudo-night cycle, when the city lights dimmed to a soft, ambient glow, the door between his containment area and the main living space slid open. Elian's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid with tension. Valerius stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the city's muted luminescence. He had removed his armor. He was dressed in a simple grey tunic and black trousers, the severe lines of the uniform doing little to soften the inherent lethality of his frame. Seeing him without the obsidian carapace was somehow more intimidating. The armor was a symbol of the system. The man himself was the source of its power. "You have not consumed the provided nourishment," Valerius stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. It was an observation, not a question. "I am not hungry." The lie was thin, unconvincing even to his own ears. Valerius stepped into the room. The shift in atmospheric pressure was immediate. His scent, no longer filtered through layers of armor and environmental seals, intensified. The clean, sharp notes of pine and steel were now underscored by something warmer, muskier, something that spoke of living flesh and blood and power. Elian's breath caught in his throat. The heat in his belly coiled tighter. "Your metabolic rate is elevated. Your body is undergoing significant biological stress. Sustenance is a logical requirement," Valerius said, his tone that of a physician addressing a recalcitrant patient. He walked over to the tray, picked up the nutrient paste, and turned back to Elian. "You will eat." Elian's defiance, a small, cold knot in his chest, held firm. No. It was a foolish, pointless rebellion, but it was the only one he had left. Valerius's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Elian saw a flicker of the same cold fury from the conduit, a brief, terrifying flash in his dark eyes. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Elian braced himself for the inevitable violence, for the force that would surely follow his insubordination. Instead, Valerius did something far more unsettling. He set the nutrient pouch down and simply watched him. His gaze was heavy, analytical, stripping him down layer by layer. The silence stretched, thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. "Your scent changes when you are defiant," Valerius murmured, his voice soft, almost conversational. The floral note sharpens, becomes acidic, fascinating. He was cataloguing him, dissecting his emotional responses as if they were chemical reactions. Elian felt a flush of heat rise in his cheeks. He was being vivisected by that cold, intelligent gaze. The clinical detachment was more violating than any physical touch. "Stop it," he whispered, the words raw. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like a puzzle. Like a machine that's broken." Valerius tilted his head. "That is precisely what you are. A component of a system that has begun to operate outside of its designated parameters. My function is to understand why." He took a step closer, and Elian instinctively shrank back, his shoulders hitting the cold wall. Valerius stopped, maintaining a careful distance. "But you are also more than that." The admission seemed to cost him something. "The data does not account for the resonance, the biological imperative." He was talking about the bond, the primal alpha-omega connection that the coalition had dismissed as myth, as pathology. He was acknowledging the invisible, undeniable force that hummed in the space between them. "I am your prisoner," Elian said, his voice trembling slightly. "That is the only imperative here." A faint, ironic smile touched Valerius's lips. "Is it?" he asked softly. "Then why did two of my best enforcers die for placing their hands on you?" The question hung in the air, a stark and brutal reminder of the truth they were both trying to rationalize away. Valerius was not just his captor, he was his protector, and Elian was not just his prisoner, he was his. The thought was a terrifying, seductive poison, and as he met the commander's dark, unreadable eyes, he knew, with sickening certainty, that he was already succumbing to it. The interrogation, when it came, was nothing like the brutal sessions whispered about in Meridian's safe houses. There were no psych probes, no pain compliance devices, no chemical truth serums. There was only Commander Valerius and the suffocating intimacy of the sterile room. He sat across from Elian at a plain metal table that had risen silently from the floor. The surface was cool and grey, a neutral territory in a war of silent wills. Valerius had placed a data slate between them, its surface dark and inactive. He did not consult it. His focus was entirely on Elian, his stormy gaze as precise and penetrating as a surgical laser. "We will begin with your point of origin," Valerius said, his voice calm, measured. "Creche 7, Sector Gamma. Designated null at age 5. Exhibited above-average aptitude in pattern recognition and data retention. Recruited for the courier program at 16. Is this data accurate?" Elian said nothing. He stared at the point on the table just to the left of the data slate, focusing on the faint, circular milling marks left by the fabricator. He would not give the system the satisfaction of his cooperation. He would be a black box, a corrupted file. Silence was his only weapon. Valerius waited, his patience a palpable force in the room. He did not fidget. He did not show any sign of frustration. He simply sat, his hands resting on the table, his posture a study in relaxed control. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. It was a pressure cooker, designed to make the subject desperate to speak, to fill the void. "Your operational file indicates a perfect compliance record for 17 years, Valerius continued, as if Elian had answered. "No emotional deviations, no biological irregularities. Your inhibitor regimen was standard dosage, lot delta 9. You were, by all metrics, a model citizen, a perfect component." He paused. "And yet, you chose to align with a faction dedicated to the disruption of the system you were designed to serve. A logical inconsistency. Explain." Elian's jaw remained locked. He would not explain his disillusionment, the slow dawning horror at the coalition's quiet cruelties, the realization that serenity was just another word for emptiness. He would not give this man, this perfect symbol of the system, the key to his own heart. He would not validate the commander's cold, analytical worldview by reducing his rebellion to a data point. The silence continued. Elian focused on his breathing, trying to regulate it, to keep it even and calm. But he could feel the frantic energy humming under his skin, the chaotic symphony of his reawakening senses. He was acutely aware of the commander's scent, that clean, sharp fragrance of pine and steel that seemed to bypass his nose and register directly in his nervous system. It made it difficult to think, to hold onto the cold, hard edges of his defiance. "Your silence is also a data point," Valerius said, his voice dropping slightly. It indicates a level of conviction that is unusual. Most Meridian operatives, when captured, follow protocol. They self-terminate or they break. You are doing neither. You are simply waiting. He leaned forward slightly, the subtle movement causing the air to shift. Alien felt a reflexive urge to lean back, to increase the distance between them, but he forced himself to remain still. What are you waiting for, Alien? The use of his name, his chosen name, not his designation, was a deliberate tactic, a scalpel designed to slip past his defenses. It sent a strange, unwelcome jolt through him. He lifted his gaze from the table and met the commander's eyes for the first time. I am waiting for you to realize that I am not an equation you can solve, he said, his voice low and steady, surprising even himself. Valerius's expression did not change, but Elian saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. Interest, genuine, unfeigned interest. All systems can be understood, Valerius countered. Even chaotic ones. Your current state is a cascade failure. The inhibitors have ceased to function, triggering a dormant biological protocol. An Omega presentation post-puberty. It is a rare phenomenon, but not an unknown one. What I need to understand is the catalyst. Was it a deliberate act on Meridian's part? A new form of biological warfare? The clinical language was a shield for both of them. It allowed Valerius to frame the situation in terms he could process, and it gave Elian something to push against. You see everything as a weapon or a malfunction, Elian said, a bitter edge to his tone. It doesn't occur to you that this could just be what I am, what you tried to erase. What you are is a citizen of the coalition, Valerius stated, the dogma automatic, ingrained. Your biology is secondary to your function. Is that what you tell yourself? Elian shot back, emboldened by a strange, reckless impulse. When you kill your own men for touching a malfunctioning component, was that your function, or was that your biology? The question hit its mark. The calm control in Valerius's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. A muscle in his jaw clenched. He had breached the sterile field of the interrogation and touched the raw, primal nerve of the event in the conduit. That, Valerius said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated in Elian's chest, was a necessary correction. The assets were compromised by proximity to an unknown biological agent. They were contaminated. They were contaminated by me. Elian pressed, pushing harder, wanting to see another crack in that perfect facade. By my scent, an alpha protecting his... What? His property? His prisoner? Valerius rose from his chair so quickly it was almost a blur. He loomed over the table, his shadow falling across the Elian. The room, which had felt spacious moments before, suddenly felt claustrophobically small. The alpha's scent flooded the space, thick and heavy with warning. It was a suffocating wave of pine and ozone and cold, sharp steel. Elian's body reacted before his mind could, a primal wave of submission and fear washing through him. He wanted to shrink, to make himself smaller, to appease the sudden, overwhelming threat. But he held the commander's gaze, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the real interrogation, not the questions and answers, but this raw, terrifying dance of instinct and control. Valerius stared down at him, his face a mask of cold fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The air crackled. Elian braced himself, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the storm passed. Valerius took a slow, deliberate breath. The tension in his shoulders eased. He straightened up, stepping back from the table. "The interrogation is concluded for now," he said, his voice once again a controlled, even tone. "You are emotionally volatile. Further questioning would yield corrupted data." He turned and walked to the door, not looking back. "Rest. We will continue tomorrow." The door slid shut, leaving Elian alone at the table, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. He had pushed the system's perfect enforcer, and for a terrifying moment, he had seen the beast lurking just beneath the polished, controlled surface. He had seen the Alpha, and some broken, treacherous part of him had not been afraid. It had been thrilled. The memory surfaced without warning, a ghost rising from the deep, still waters of his suppressed past. It was not a coherent narrative, but a series of sensory impressions, sharp and vivid as shards of glass. The scent of antiseptic solution, the cool, smooth touch of a medical drone's manipulator arm, the low, soothing hum of the creche's atmospheric regulator. He was small, no older than 5, lying on a diagnostic slab in a room that was a perfect miniature of the one he was in now. White walls, soft light, the absence of any unnecessary detail. A med-tech, her face a neutral mask of professional calm, stood beside the slab, her voice a soft, melodic monotone. "This is your inhibitor, 734, she had said, holding up a small, transparent patch. "It will help you maintain serenity. It will keep the chaos away. The Coalition provides it because it cares for your well-being. Control is serenity. Serenity is function." He remembered the slight sting as she applied the patch to the back of his neck, a tiny pinprick of cold that was quickly followed by a spreading numbness. It was not just a physical sensation, it was an emotional one, a subtle muting of the world, as if a pane of glass had been placed between him and his own feelings. Before the patch, he remembered things differently. He remembered the faint, warm, milky scent of the Omega caregiver who managed their creche unit. He remembered the sharp, spicy smell of the Alpha proctor who taught them their letters and numbers. He remembered the subtle, unique scent of the other children, a complex tapestry of sweet and sour and salt that told him who was happy, who was scared, who was sad. He hadn't known the words for it then, Alpha, Omega, scent, but he had understood the language. It was a language of connection, of emotion, of belonging. The inhibitor had erased it. The world became flat, odorless, a two-dimensional space where people were just shapes moving through corridors. The warmth of the caregiver became just a neutral temperature. The sharpness of the proctor became just a loud voice. The other children became obstacles. He learned the new language quickly, the language of the Coalition, the language of data, of function, of emotional suppression. He learned that the faint, ghost feelings that sometimes flickered at the edges of his awareness were anomalies, deviations, to be reported and corrected with a slight adjustment to his dosage. He excelled. His ability to disconnect, to feel nothing, made him a model student. The absence of emotional distraction allowed him to focus, to absorb information with flawless retention. He was praised for his calm, his control, his serenity. He was praised for his emptiness. He was not a child. He was an asset in development. The memory of the caregiver's milky scent was the first to fade completely, overwritten by the sterile hum of the creche. He forgot the comfort of it, the unconditional safety it had represented. He learned that safety came not from connection, but from isolation, from being a null, from being invisible. He remembered one of the other children, a boy whose designation was lost to time, who had reacted badly to the inhibitors. The boy had cried for days, a thin, wailing sound that was quickly muffled by the creche's sound-dampening walls. He had complained of a phantom itch under his skin, a buzzing in his head. He had tried to claw his patch off, his small hands leaving red scratches on his neck. The medtechs had called it an adverse biological reaction. The boy was taken away for recalibration. He never came back. Elian learned the lesson well. To feel was to be flawed. To be flawed was to be removed. He embraced the numbness. He made it his shield, his identity. When Meridian had recruited him, they had seen the same thing the Coalition had. A perfect vessel. An empty shell that could be filled with their data, their secrets, their hope. They saw a ghost who could walk through walls, his lack of scent a perfect camouflage. They hadn't seen a person, because there wasn't one left. There was only a function, a designation, a carefully constructed void. Lying on the sleeping platform in Valerius's sterile chamber, the ghost of that first inhibitor tingled on the back of his neck. For the first time, he understood that the patch had not been a gift. It had not been a tool for serenity. It had been a lock, a chemical cage designed to starve the creature living inside him. And now, after 17 years, the lock was broken. The cage was open, and the creature was starving. The hunger was a deep, aching hollowness that the nutrient paste could not touch. It was a craving for sensation, for connection, for the world that had been stolen from him. It was terrifying. He was a stranger in his own body, a passenger in a vessel that was suddenly responding to a new, incomprehensible set of commands. The buzzing under his skin, the phantom itch the other boy had felt, was back. His own scent, the sweet floral perfume of his distress, was a constant, cloying reminder of his loss of control. He curled into a ball, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to contain the chaotic explosion happening within him. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a boy in a white room who had been taught that his own nature was a disease. He thought of Commander Valerius, the Alpha, the system's enforcer. The man was as much a product of the Coalition's conditioning as he was. Valerius's control was legendary, his emotional suppression absolute. And yet, in the conduit, that control had shattered. The beast inside the commander had recognized the beast inside him. The system had created two perfect cogs, two model citizens, and in a moment of unforeseen chemical failure, their core programming had defaulted to something older, something wilder. It was a flaw in the system's design, a beautiful, terrifying, catastrophic flaw. The irony was so bitter it tasted like blood. The Coalition, in its quest for perfect order, had created the very conditions for the ultimate chaos, a fated bond between its greatest enforcer and its most wanted dissident. As the pseudo-daylight cycle began to brighten the room, casting long, stark shadows across the floor, Elian finally understood. He was not waiting for escape. He was not waiting for termination. He was waiting for the system to tear itself apart, with him and the commander at its very heart. The thought did not bring him fear. It brought him a strange, terrible sense of peace. For the first time since he was 5 years old, he felt a flicker of something that was not an anomaly, not a deviation, but a genuine, unregulated emotion. Hope. The next cycle brought a new kind of violation. Valerius did not enter the containment area himself. Instead, a gleaming white medical drone, a multi-limbed apparatus of sensors and articulated arms, floated silently into the room. It hovered over Elian's sleeping platform, its optical sensors glowing with a soft, blue, analytical light. A synthesized voice, perfectly modulated for calm reassurance, emanated from its chassis. Subject 734. Please remain still for a full-spectrum biological analysis. This procedure is non-invasive and is required for your continued well-being. Elian sat up, pulling his legs to his chest, his eyes fixed on the machine. He knew it was being controlled remotely by Valerius. The drone was an extension of the commander, a sterile proxy that allowed him to conduct his examination without the risk of contamination, without the risk of his own control failing again. "I do not consent," Elian said, the words feeling futile even as he spoke them. "Consent is not a required parameter for this diagnostic," the drone replied smoothly. "Your anomalous biological state presents a potential risk. Analysis is mandatory. Please remain still." One of the drone's arms extended, a delicate scanner at its tip that pulsed with a gentle light. It moved toward his neck, toward the place where his inhibitor patch used to be. Elian flinched away, scrambling to the far corner of the platform. "Do not touch me." The drone paused, its programming likely encountering an unexpected resistance variable. It hovered for a moment, its sensors whirring softly as it processed. "Compliance is the optimal path to a positive outcome," the synthesized voice advised. Elian knew it was useless to resist. The drone could sedate him, restrain him, but the defiance was a reflex now, a desperate assertion of his own agency in a situation where he had none. In the main chamber, Valerius watched the scene on a high-resolution monitor. He saw Elian pressed against the wall, his body tense, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. He saw the drone hovering, a sterile insect waiting to collect its sample. He had chosen to use the drone for logical reasons. It was more efficient. It could gather more precise data than his own senses could. It eliminated the variable of his presence, which clearly caused the subject emotional distress and skewed the readings. And it kept him from having to be in the same small space, breathing the same air, saturated with that maddening, intoxicating scent of burnt sugar and jasmine. It was a logical, tactical decision. It felt like an act of cowardice. His hand clenched on the edge of the console. He was the commander. His will was absolute. His control was the bedrock of his identity. But the memory of the conduit, the feel of bone and cartilage giving way under his gauntlet, the blinding, white-hot rage that had erased everything but the primal need to eliminate the hands that were on his Omega. That memory was a crack in the foundation. He could not risk it happening again. He could not risk losing control. Not yet. Not until he understood the nature of the weapon Meridian had unleashed. Because that's what this had to be. A targeted biological agent designed to incapacitate the Coalition's command structure from the inside out. Elian was not a victim. He was the vector. Override subjects' non-compliance. He subvocalized into his comlink. Administer a low-grade sedative if necessary. On the screen, the drone moved forward again. Another, thinner arm extended from its chassis, this one tipped with a micro-injector. Elian saw it coming and squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the sting. But the injection never came. Valerius watched the monitor, his finger hovering over the command input. He saw the terror in Elian's posture, the surrender. He was treating the boy like a lab specimen, a contaminated sample to be catalogued and neutralized. The image of the enforcer's blood, stark and red against the white floor flashed in his mind. Contamination, unsanctioned contact. He was the one who had deemed their touch a contamination, and now he was ordering a machine to do the same, to pierce the boy's skin, to violate his boundaries. The hypocrisy was a bitter taste in his mouth. "Belay that order," he commanded, his voice sharp. The drone stopped instantly, its limbs retracting. It hovered, awaiting new instructions. Valerius stared at the screen, at the trembling, defiant figure in the corner. He was not a vector. He was not a weapon. He was a terrified young man whose entire world, whose very body, was betraying him. The system he served, the system Valerius served, had done this to him. "Continue with the non-invasive scan only," he ordered. "Maintain a minimum distance of 1 meter from the subject." The drone complied, its blue light sweeping over Elian's body from a respectful distance. It analyzed his respiration, his heart rate, his skin temperature, the chemical composition of the air around him. The data streamed onto Valerius's console in a cascade of numbers and graphs. Heart rate, 132 EBPM. Respiration, shallow and rapid. Dermal temperature, elevated. Cortisol levels, critical. And the scent. The drone's chemical sensors broke it down into its constituent molecules, a complex chain of esters and pheromones that the system's database had no classification for. It was unique, a perfect match for only one other sample in the entire coalition database. A trace signature Valerius himself had been tracking for months, a ghost scent he had believed to be a sensor malfunction at meridian-linked locations. It hadn't been a ghost, it had been him. Then the final report scrolled onto the screen, a deep-level analysis of Elian's metabolic byproducts, cross-referenced with the pharmaceutical records for lot delta 9 inhibitors. Valerius's blood ran cold. He read the summary twice, then a third time, the clinical language painting a picture of methodical, systemic cruelty. Lot delta 9. An experimental batch. The base compound was flawed, unstable. It didn't just suppress omega biology. It attacked it. Over time, it caused a slow, cascading failure of the endocrine system, leading to cellular degradation and, eventually, total systemic collapse. The inhibitors weren't just a cage. They were a poison, a slow, quiet death sentence wrapped in the coalition's promise of serenity. And the sudden, potent scent presentation. It wasn't an attack. It was a fever. It was the desperate final scream of a body trying to fight off the poison, trying to signal its distress in the only way it knew how. A distress call only an alpha was equipped to hear. Valerius stared at Elian's image on the screen. The boy was no longer a puzzle to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. He was a victim of the same cold, calculating system that had made Valerius its perfect soldier. The data chip he had taken from Elian, the one he had assumed contained Meridian's plans, was likely full of this. Proof that the coalition wasn't just controlling its citizens. It was silently, efficiently, executing those it deemed flawed. His entire world, his entire belief system, tilted on its axis. The perfect order he had dedicated his life to, upholding, was built on a foundation of lies and poison. And the boy in the next room, the enemy he had captured, was the living, breathing proof of it. The bond he felt, the primal, possessive rage. It wasn't a biological weapon. It was an alarm, a signal he had been conditioned his entire life to ignore, but that was now screaming at him, undeniable and true. Protect. The imperative was no longer a confusing, primal echo. It was a clear, cold, logical command. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the atmospheric pressure of his confinement. The sterile silence no longer felt empty and menacing. It felt watchful. The nutrient paste and water no longer appeared from a hidden panel. The door to the main chamber slid open, and Valerius himself brought the tray. He placed it on the small table, his movements economical and precise as always. But there was a new quality to his stillness, a lack of the cold, analytical judgment that had been there before. He did not speak. He simply set down the tray and retreated, the door hissing shut behind him. Elian stared at the tray. Beside the standard rations was a small synthetic fruit, a rare luxury usually reserved for the coalition's elite. It was a peace offering, a concession, a silent apology. He didn't touch it. Trust was a currency he no longer possessed. Later, Valerius opened the door again. This time, he did not retreat. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had reinstated the interrogation table, but he did not ask Elian to sit. "The medical analysis is complete," he said, his voice a low, neutral tone. Elian waited, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. "The inhibitors you were administered were from a defective batch," Valerius continued, the clinical words a stark contrast to the enormity of their meaning. "They were improperly synthesized. They have caused a severe adverse reaction." He was editing the truth, softening the blow. He didn't say poisoned. He didn't say lethal. He said defective and adverse reaction. The system's language was designed to minimize, to obscure, to control the narrative, even in the face of its own monstrous failures. "What does that mean?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It means your body is attempting to purge a foreign agent. The process is causing the spontaneous biological presentation. It is a severe strain on your system." Valerius's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Without medical intervention, it will be fatal." The word hung in the air between them. Fatal. Elian felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't despair. It was clarity. The end had a name now. It was no longer an abstract fear, but a concrete reality. "And what is the medical intervention?" he asked, a bitter, ironic smile touching his lips. "Recalibration? Termination?" "No," Valerius said, the word sharp, absolute. "There is an antidote, a stabilizing agent. It will counteract the effects of the faulty compound and allow your system to heal." "And you'll give it to me? Your prisoner? Your enemy?" "Yes." The answer was immediate, without a hint of hesitation. It was this, more than anything, that shook Elian. The simple, unconditional certainty of it. This went beyond the actions of a captor. This was something else. "Why?" Elian asked, the question raw with suspicion and a desperate, fragile hope. Valerius was silent for a long moment, his stormy eyes searching Elian's face. He seemed to be weighing his words, calculating the precise level of truth the situation required. "Your value as an intelligence asset is contingent on your survival," he said finally, falling back on the familiar logic of the system. "Dead, you are merely a collection of compromised data. Alive, you are a key." It was a lie, a partial truth at best. They both knew it. The real reason was humming in the air between them, in the intense, focused way the Alpha was watching him, in the protective scent that was a subtle but constant presence in the room. Elian looked away, his gaze falling to the synthetic fruit on the tray. A small, perfect sphere of engineered nutrition, a symbol of the coalition's manufactured care. "I don't believe you," he said softly. "Belief is not required," Valerius replied. "Compliance is." He left the doorway and returned a moment later with a medical injector, a sleek silver device that looked far more sophisticated than the crude hyposprays used in the creches. He held it out. "This will not suppress what is happening to you," he explained, his voice even. "It will only stop the poison. Your biology will need to stabilize on its own." Elian stared at the injector, then back at Valerius. He saw no deception in the commander's eyes, only a grim, unwavering resolve. He was being offered a lifeline by the man who should have been his executioner. The primal, instinctual part of him, the part that had recognized the Alpha's scent as safe, urged him to accept. The conditioned, rational part of him screamed that it was a trick, another form of control. He was caught between two opposing forces, his own nature and the nature that had been forced upon him. Slowly, hesitantly, he rose from the platform. He walked toward Valerius, each step an act of will. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his body trembling slightly. He was giving his life, what was left of it, into the hands of his enemy. He held out his arm. Valerius took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The proximity was staggering. The commander's scent washed over Elian in a warm, enveloping wave, making his head swim. Pine, steel, and the underlying musk of a powerful, healthy alpha. It short-circuited his fear, replacing it with a dizzying, terrifying sense of rightness. Valerius's hand was unexpectedly gentle as he took Elian's arm. His fingers were long and cool, his grip firm, but not painful. His touch sent a jolt of pure energy through Elian's system, a spark that lit up every nerve ending. He had been touched by the enforcers, a rough, impersonal contact. This was different. This was deliberate. This was personal. Valerius pressed the injector against a vein in Elian's forearm. There was a soft hiss, and a cool liquid flowed into him. Elian watched the commander's face, searching for any sign of betrayal. He saw only intense, focused concentration. When it was done, Valerius withdrew the injector, but did not release his arm. He held it for a moment longer, his thumb stroking softly over the injection site. The small, intimate gesture was more shocking than the violence in the conduit. It was an act of tenderness, an act of care. It was something Elian had not experienced since he was 5 years old, in the arms of a caregiver whose scent he could no longer remember. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. Valerius's gaze flickered to the tear, his expression tightening. He released Elian's arm as if he'd been burned and took a step back, re-establishing the distance, rebuilding the wall between them. "The antidote will take time to work," he said, his voice strained, rougher than before. "Rest." He turned and left without another word, the door sealing him away in his own side of the gilded cage. Elian stood in the center of the room, his hand cradling the arm the commander had touched. The cool relief of the medicine was already beginning to spread through his veins, but it was overshadowed by a different sensation. A slow, spreading warmth that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the brief, shocking, and utterly transformative moment of contact. The power dynamic had shifted again. He was no longer just a prisoner, and Valerius was no longer just a captor. They were two broken pieces of the same corrupt system, bound together by a poison, a secret, and a primal, undeniable truth. The blare of the alarm was a physical assault, a screaming, crimson slash through the carefully maintained serenity of the commander's quarters. Red lights pulsed in time with the siren's frantic rhythm, casting the sterile white walls in a bloody, apocalyptic glow. The floor vibrated with the distant, percussive thud of explosions. The city, the perfect, silent machine, was screaming. Elian was thrown from a restless sleep, his heart instantly hammering in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, his mind struggling to catch up with the sudden chaos. The armored glass wall, which had been a window onto a serene grid of light, now showed plumes of black smoke rising from the lower sectors. Traces of plasma fire stitched fiery patterns across the night sky. The rebellion. Meridian was making its move. They were attacking the heart of the coalition's power, the very command tower where he was being held. The door to his containment area slid open. Valerius stood there, already clad in his obsidian armor, his helmet under his arm. The calm, analytical scientist was gone, replaced by the lethal enforcer. His face was a mask of cold, focused intensity, but his eyes, when they met aliens, held a new, complex depth. "Meridian has breached the sector perimeter," Valerius said, his voice cutting cleanly through the din of the alarms. "They are targeting this tower. They believe you are being held here for interrogation and are attempting a rescue." Or an assassination, Elian thought, to silence the witness, to prevent him from breaking and revealing their secrets. Meridian was as ruthless as the coalition, in its own way. Two sides of the same tarnished coin. A holographic comm panel flickered to life on Valerius's gauntlet. The face of a severe-looking woman, an overseer from high command, appeared. Her expression was grim. "Commander," she snapped, her voice tight with urgency. "Report. What is the status of the biological contaminant?" Contaminant. That was his official designation now. Elian felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Valerius's gaze did not leave his. "The asset is secure," he replied, his tone perfectly even. "Overseer, the Meridian forces are using unconventional tactics. They have bypassed the lower-level defenses. I am moving to coordinate the counter-assault." "Negative, Commander," the Overseer ordered, her eyes like chips of flint. "Your primary directive has changed. The contaminant, Subject 734, is the epicenter of this instability. His anomalous pheromonal signature is causing localized sensor ghosts and communication disruptions. He is a biological weapon, active and hostile." It was a lie, a fabrication to justify what was coming next. The system was protecting itself, rewriting the narrative to eliminate the evidence of its own crimes. "The data from the initial analysis does not support that conclusion," Valerius stated, a subtle edge of defiance in his voice. "The data is irrelevant, Commander," the Overseer snarled. "Your orders are clear. Terminate the contaminant, sanitize the area, eliminate the source of the disruption before it compromises the entire sector grid. Acknowledge." Valerius stood frozen for a fraction of a second, a statue of black armor and impossible choices. On one side was his duty, his entire life, the unwavering chain of command that had defined his existence. On the other was the trembling, wide-eyed boy in front of him, the Omega. His instincts screamed at him to protect. The victim of a systemic poison he had sworn to uphold. The boy who was, he was forced to admit in the silent, screaming chaos of the moment, his mate. He looked at Elian, and in that single, shared glance, an entire conversation took place. Elian saw the conflict in the commander's eyes, the war between conditioning and instinct. He saw the terrible weight of the choice Valerius had to make. and he saw, with a sudden, heart-stopping certainty, which side was going to win. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it. Don't throw away everything for me." It was a plea for the commander to save himself, but Valerius's expression hardened, the conflict resolving into a cold, diamond-hard certainty. He had served the system his entire life. He had upheld its lies, enforced its sterile cruelties. He had believed in its promise of order. But the system was a poison, and it was demanding that he murder the only thing that had ever felt true. "Commander, acknowledge the order," the overseer's voice shrieked from the comm. Valerius raised his gauntlet, not to acknowledge, but to silence her. He deactivated the comm link, severing his connection to High Command, severing his connection to his past, to his identity. He was no longer Commander Valerius, the system's perfect enforcer. He was a traitor. The silence that fell between them was more profound than the noise of the attack raging outside. It was the silence of a world ending and a new one beginning. "They will not stop," Valerius said, his voice low, devoid of any emotion except a grim, absolute resolve. "They will send an elite unit. They will level this entire floor if they have to. We cannot stay here. We..." The word hung in the air, a declaration, a vow. It bound them together, two fugitives against the world. Elian's fear, which had been a cold, paralyzing weight, was suddenly burned away by a surge of something hot and fierce. He was not a contaminant. He was not a victim. He was a survivor. And for the first time, he was not alone. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steady. Valerius slid his helmet on. The polarized visor descended, hiding his eyes, transforming him back into the impersonal, lethal machine of the state. But Elian knew it was a lie. He knew the man inside the armor now. "Meridian's attack has created a window of chaos," Valerius said, his voice a filtered, electronic calm. "Order has broken down. We will use that chaos. There is a private hangar on the sub-levels, an unregistered transport. If we can reach it..." He didn't need to finish. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble. They would be hunted by both sides. The coalition would want to eliminate its traitors, and Meridian would want to silence its loose ends. A fresh explosion, closer this time, rocked the tower. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, illuminated only by the strobing red emergency beacons and the fires raging outside. Valerius drew a heavy plasma pistol from his thigh holster. The weapon hummed to life, its blue energy cell casting his armored form in an eerie light. He turned to Elian. "Stay behind me," he commanded. "Do not stop. Do not hesitate. Do you understand?" Elian nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He understood. This was no longer about escape. It was about survival. And as he fell into step behind the towering, armored figure of the man who was now his only ally, he felt the last vestiges of Elian 734, the null, the perfect cog, fall away like dust. He was just Elian, and he was finally, terrifyingly, ready to fight. The descent was a journey through hell. The pristine, silent corridors of the command tower had become a war zone, a charnel house of twisted metal, shattered glass, and the dead. The air, once so pure, was thick with the acrid stench of burnt permacrete, ozone from plasma discharges, and the coppery tang of blood. Emergency systems shrieked, their alarms a constant, nerve-shredding counterpoint to the concussive rhythm of the battle raging through the structure. Valerius moved through the chaos like a ghost of vengeance. He was no longer a commander directing forces. He was a singular, unstoppable force of nature. His plasma pistol spat coherent bolts of energy with terrifying precision, each shot finding its mark in the chest or head of the coalition enforcers who now saw him as their target. He did not waste motion. He did not hesitate. He was the system's finest weapon, turned back on itself. Elian followed in his wake, a shadow clinging to the Alpha's armored back. His senses, raw and overloaded, struggled to process the onslaught. The flashing lights, the deafening explosions, the screams of the dying. It was a symphony of total systemic collapse. His training as a courier had prepared him for stealth, for evasion, not for the front lines of a firefight. But a strange, cold calm had settled over him. His fear was a distant thing, a faint hum beneath the all-consuming, instinctual need to stay close to Valerius. The Alpha's presence was an anchor in the storm, his scent a shield against the reek of death and destruction. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a squad of 4 enforcers, their rifles raised. "Traitor!" one of them yelled, his voice distorted by his helmet's vocoder. "Surrender the asset!" Valerius didn't break stride. He raised his pistol and fired twice, 2 of the enforcers dropping before they could even return fire. The other 2 opened up, a hail of plasma bolts searing the air where Valerius had been a second before. The commander moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, closing the distance while the enforcers were still tracking his last position. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the visor of the 3rd man, shattering it, then drove his armored elbow into the throat of the 4th. It was over in seconds, brutal, efficient, silent. Elian stared at the crumpled forms, his stomach churning. These were the same soldiers Valerius had commanded just hours ago, men who had followed his orders without question. Now he cut them down without a flicker of remorse. "Move," Valerius ordered, his voice a flat, electronic rasp. He did not look at the men he had killed. They were obstacles, nothing more. As they navigated a debris-strewn corridor, a section of the ceiling groaned and collapsed, showering them with dust and rubble. Valerius reacted instantly, spinning around and shoving Elian against the wall, shielding him with his own body as a heavy Durasteel beam crashed down where they had been standing. The impact was deafening. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. For a moment, Elian was pinned between the cold wall and the unyielding plate of Valerius's armor. He could feel the solid warmth of the man's body through the powered suit, hear the steady thrum of its internal mechanics. The Alpha's scent, sharp and clean, even through the dust and smoke, filled his lungs. In that moment of violent chaos, pressed against his protector, Elian felt a profound, illogical sense of peace. The danger was outside this small, intimate space. Here, he was safe. Valerius pushed himself off the wall, his helmet turning to scan Elian for injuries. "Are you harmed?" "No," Elian managed to choke out, coughing on the dust. I'm fine." "Good." Without another word, he turned and continued on, his pace unbroken. They reached the lower levels where the fighting was less intense. Here, the damage was more structural, the result of Meridian's initial assault. Emergency bulkheads had sealed off entire sections, forcing them to find alternate routes through dark, claustrophobic service tunnels. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of coolant and damp metal. In the oppressive darkness, broken only by the blue glow of Valerius's pistol, Elian's other senses took over. He could hear the drip of water from a ruptured pipe, the scuttling of a maintenance drone in a nearby conduit. and he could feel Valerius's presence in a way that transcended sight. It was a warmth, a weight in the darkness, a steady, reassuring beacon. He found himself walking closer to the commander, his hand almost brushing against the armored plates of his leg. The instinct to touch, to seek reassurance, was a powerful, undeniable urge. He fought it down. They were not allies, they were fugitives, bound by necessity. That was all. They finally reached a heavy blast door marked with a restricted access symbol. Valerius placed his palm on the scanner. For a tense second, nothing happened. Elian held his breath. Had his command access already been revoked? Then the panel flashed green and the door hissed open. The hangar was small, utilitarian, containing a single, sleek transport craft. It was matte black, with no identifying marks, a ghost ship for a ghost commander. It was their way out. As they crossed the hangar floor, a new group of figures emerged from the shadows. Not coalition enforcers. These were leaner, dressed in the dark, pragmatic gear of Meridian operatives, and at their head was a woman Elian recognized, Kaelin, his handler, the woman who had recruited him, trained him, sent him on this final, fatal mission. "Elian," she said, her voice cool, her pistol aimed squarely at his chest. "You've caused us a great deal of trouble." Her eyes flickered to the towering figure beside him. "And you, Commander. A surprising development. We came to silence a liability. It seems we get to eliminate a monster as well." Valerius stepped in front of Elian, shielding him completely. "He is not your asset anymore," Valerius said, his voice dangerously low. Kaelin laughed, a short, sharp, humorless sound. "He was never an asset. He was bait. We knew about the faulty inhibitors. We knew it would cause a reaction. We just didn't know it would be you who took the bait so perfectly." The world tilted under Elian's feet. The proof he was carrying, it wasn't for the rebellion. It was to lure an alpha, to create a scandal, a weakness in the coalition's command. He had been a pawn, a sacrifice. "You used me," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. "All systems have disposable parts," Kaelin said with a shrug. "Now, step aside, Commander. Let us clean up our mess." Valerius raised his pistol. "That will not be happening." The hangar exploded into a maelstrom of plasma fire. The world outside the city was a revelation of silence. After the screaming alarms and the thunder of explosions, the quiet was a physical presence, a soft, heavy blanket that settled over Elian's raw nerves. The only sounds were the whisper of a dry wind across the desolate landscape and the faint, fading hum of the stolen transport's engines as Valerius brought it to a gentle landing. He had flown them out of the city's wreckage with the same unnerving calm and precision he did everything else, evading coalition pursuers and Meridian fighters alike in the chaotic skies. Now, they were somewhere in the outlands, the vast, barren expanse of land the coalition had abandoned centuries ago, deeming it unfit for their perfect, ordered society. Valerius powered down the ship. The silence deepened. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They sat in the cockpit, the dust-choked, rust-colored landscape stretching out before them, lit by the pale, unfamiliar light of a dawn unfiltered by atmospheric processes or city domes. The rising sun was a raw, glorious wound on the horizon. In the hangar, there had been no choice. Kaelin and her soldiers had intended to kill them both. Valerius had responded with the brutal efficiency of a cornered predator. The fight was short and one-sided. Meridian's operatives, skilled as they were
were no match for the raw power and tactical genius of the coalition's greatest enforcer, fighting for his life and for the life of his mate. The last thing Elian remembered seeing before Valerius had pulled him into the transport was Kaylin's face, her expression of cool confidence shattered into one of shock and disbelief as the commander closed in on her. He didn't know if she was alive or dead. He found he didn't care. He had been a tool for two opposing machines, and both had tried to discard him when his purpose was served. Only the man beside him, the one who should have been his ultimate enemy, had chosen to protect him. The airlock hissed open, and the smell of the outside world flooded the cockpit. It was an overwhelming cascade of sensation. It smelled of dust and dry earth, of strange, wild vegetation, of rain that had fallen hours ago and was now evaporating from the cracked ground. It was a complex, organic, living scent, so different from the sterile, manufactured air of the coalition that it made Elian's head spin. It smelled like freedom. Valerius unsealed his helmet and pulled it off, dropping it onto the empty co-pilot's seat. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He was no longer a commander. He was no longer an enforcer. He was a traitor, a fugitive, a man with no system, no rank, no identity. He was just Valerius. He turned to look at Elian, his stormy eyes reflecting the pale morning light. The analytical coldness was gone, replaced by something softer, something uncertain. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Elian nodded, unable to find words. He was alive. He was free. He was with the man who had torn down the world to save him. He was 1,000 things other than all right. He reached up and touched the back of his neck, where the inhibitor patch had been. The skin was clean. The poison was being purged from his system. The cage was gone. But he didn't know how to live without it. He didn't know how to be the creature that had been unlocked. "What now?" he whispered, the question encompassing everything. Their future, their survival, the strange, powerful, terrifying thing that existed between them. Valerius looked out at the vast, empty landscape. "Now," he said, "we learn to live outside the machine." He stood and walked to the open airlock, pausing at the edge of the ramp. He looked back at Elian, his expression unreadable, and then stepped out onto the rust-colored soil. He did not invite Elian to follow. He simply waited. Elian took a deep breath of the wild, untamed air and followed him. The ground was uneven under his soft-soled boots. The wind tugged at his uniform, a playful, insistent caress. He lifted his face to the sky, a vast, open expanse of pale blue and soft grey, so different from the contained, artificial sky of the city dome. And the sun. The sun was a physical warmth on his skin, a gentle, persistent heat that seemed to seep into his very bones. It was the first time in his life he had ever felt direct sunlight. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a dizzying cocktail of sensory overload and profound, earth-shattering relief. His legs felt weak. He stumbled, and a strong hand caught his arm, steadying him. Valerius. He stood beside him, his grip firm, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in this vast, new world. Elian looked up at him. The morning light softened the hard angles of his face, revealing a vulnerability Elian had never seen before. The monster, the perfect soldier, was gone. In his place was just a man, an alpha, his alpha. The realization bloomed in his chest, not with fear, but with a quiet, startling certainty. He was an Omega.
his Omega. The unspoken truth passed between them in the silent language of scent and instinct. Valerius's scent was different out here, in the open air. The cold steel note had faded, replaced by the richer, earthier scent of pine and warm stone. It was the scent of a protector, a guardian. Elian's own scent, the sweet perfume of burnt sugar and jasmine, softened in response, losing its sharp, acidic edge of fear and becoming something softer, calmer, a scent of homecoming. Valerius released his arm, but he did not step away. They stood side by side, two fugitives in the dawn of a new, uncertain world, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. The coalition, with its sterile order and quiet cruelties, was behind them. Ahead lay only the unknown. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. Elian was no longer an asset. He was no longer an experiment. He was not a null. He was Elian. He was an Omega. And he was, for the very first time in his life, completely and utterly free. He looked at the man beside him, the architect of both his captivity and his liberation, and felt the first fragile blossoming of a feeling he had no name for, a feeling that was warmer and brighter than the rising sun. And in the quiet gaze that Valerius returned, he saw the faint, mirrored reflection of that same nameless hope.